today, starting with just a general overview of the current market dynamics and the situation at hand. So as Andrew mentioned in the earlier presentation, even though the country has emerged from a recession, the real estate services sector continues to trail, and technically we are still in a recession for that sector. So the last 5 quarters have shown a consistent negative growth for the real estate services sector. In the commercial market sector, we continue to have an oversupply or a situation in which there is an imbalance in terms of what demand there is out there versus the supply that's available. Most of my presentation will cover just the prime end or the grade A office market and not really look at the grade B or C market in Lagos. I think given the headwinds that we've experienced over the last few years, there continue to be pressure on rents, and they've continued to go down steadily over the last 2 to 3 years. In terms of demand and supply, I think I'll start with take up in prime grade office space. Looking at the last 24 to 36 months, we've seen that take up year on year has slowed. So take up in 2016 was about 58%, and in 2017 it was about half of that. And for 2018, we're showing that we're probably at the 50% of what we had in 2017. Although there are a lot of transactions that are towards the tail end, I think that at the end of the year we'll still show a position where the take up in 2018 is less than what it was in 2017. I think that we also need to look at the stock in terms of what's there, and then also what's coming onto the market. Over the next 6 to 12 months, even given the oversupply of space, we're expected to have another 40 to 50,000 square meters of prime grade office space coming onto the market. So I think looking into the future, there will be continued competition amongst developers and landlords to attract the shallow pool of tenants that are available in the market. When we look at vacancy and rents, there's a very high vacancy rent level in both the Ikoyi and Victoria markets, where we have most of the prime grade buildings located. In Ikoyi, we're showing a vacancy rate on average about 77%. So a lot of empty buildings, and in Victoria Island about 52%. When we look at, for developers, when you build and you deliver buildings, how long it takes to actually reach full occupancy, or at least 80% occupancy, we're seeing that it's taking longer and longer in this market. So for many of the buildings that were delivered in the last 4 years, it's taking 3+ years to achieve near full occupancy. When we look at net rentals or base rentals, currently, in the last 6 months, base rentals have actually remained flat. And what's happening is that the difference between your base rentals and then what you actually get in terms of incentives, there's more and more of a gap in terms of your net effective rent versus your basic rent. So for instance, if a landlord is offering you $800 per square meter in office space, they're also providing a lot of additional incentives in the form of rent-free periods and in the form of tenant improvement allowances that then discount the total obligation that's due to a tenant over the course of the year. So if, say, rentals are between $600 to $800 in terms of base rent, we're seeing that the net effective rent are about 25 to 35% below that level and that number. So one of the things I wanted to do was to look at the office market and look at the prime grade buildings in the market spread across Ikoyi and VI, and to compare and see whether there's a correlation between the types of amenities provided and the vacancy levels. So Are tenants paying a premium? Are tenants more willing to go into buildings? And is one of the drivers really what types of amenities you're providing in addition to the quality of the building? So we looked at about 13 buildings in Lagos. Building A through K were buildings that have been developed from 2014 to 2018. And there are 2 buildings that are currently in the pipeline. And on the top of at the top of the chart, we have the vacancy levels, and at the bottom we have the amount of amenities that are provided. So on the left-hand side, we looked at a number of different criteria. So whether the building had cafe or cafeteria, was it green certified, raised floors, did it have a component of residential or hotel, is there a retail component, banking, ATMs, the parking at least 1 to 50 square meters per bay. Do they have additional meeting rooms that are shared? And then are there shared office or serviced office provision within the buildings, and then a gym? I think what you can see is if you look at the left-hand side of the chart, you can see that the buildings with the lowest vacancy rates, with exception of one, which is an owner-occupied building, have the most amount of amenities provided. And I think going into this, we did know that based on the kinds of requests that we get from tenants and occupiers, that this was a case, that the more you provide to the tenants within the buildings, the more attractive that building would be for them. So in general, I think just looking at it, cafes and cafeterias, raised floors and gyms were standard office provisions within the grade A buildings in Lagos. Okay, sorry. Sorry, guys. Okay. So outside of just the amenities and the building design and the quality of the space, what else is driving occupier demand in the market? I think one of the things that we've seen steadily over the last year or two is an uptick in demand for turnkey solutions and co-working offices provided within the grade A buildings that the occupiers were looking at. So we're seeing that occupiers are seeking more increased flexibility and less barriers to exit, which means they don't want to put up the initial capital outlay to do their fit out and to buy their furniture. They would like the landlord or the developer to take that on their behalf and then rentalize it over the lease period. We're seeing a lot of that, not just in Nigeria, but also in the global market with the emergence and the growth of service office providers like WeWork. So people are looking, tenants and corporates are looking more for a turnkey solution, a plug-and-play solution where they can just move in and everything is already done, and then they pay, quarterly, biannually, annually. And I think in addition to the not having to put up the initial capital, I think the other thing that's really important to them is actually the flexibility of the lease. So you can take up space when you need it, you can hand it back when you don't need it, you can flex up and down based on projects, you don't have to hold on to space, growth space, for a 5-year lease that you might not need until year 4 or 5. So looking at ways to ensure that their costs are in line with what they're actually using their office for. So we went into the market just to understand the co-working office sector in the Lagos market. We wanted to understand what the supply is, what's out there, whether it's meeting the needs of occupiers. So I think we saw that there's been exponential growth in the number of co-working providers in the market. In terms of how successful they've been, most of the service providers that we talked to were at least 75% occupied, so very low vacancy rate. A lot of them were fully occupied. And many of them were already looking at strategies for expansion and rolling out into the market. And I think the important thing to note, though, is that the quality of the co-working offices that we explored were not really in line with what the international and multinational clients were interested in. So you find a lot of residential conversions, being used for co-working. And that market really caters to startups and tech companies and indigenous small companies, and not really the big multinationals. And when you look at the provision in a lot of the grade A space, there is a lack of serviced office space in those buildings. So there's definitely still a gap in terms of providing for flexibility for tenants and occupiers. So where we have multinational clients, they do want serviced office space, but they are looking for serviced office space in buildings that are grade A, that have parking amenities, adequate parking amenities, that have mixed use elements and some retail. They want HSE standards, international standards met. And this still poses a gap in the current market. So looking forward, I think the market is it's still anticipated to grow, albeit slowly. We looked at the impact of the 2019 elections, and in the last quarter as well as this quarter, we haven't really seen an impact the same way we did see during the last election cycle on the market. So transactions are going on, corporates are still making long-term decisions, and there's not a fear of political instability or what might happen. We're looking at rents bottoming out, not now, but probably in the medium term, because there is still some supply that will come onto the market soon. As I mentioned, 40,000 square meters of space in the grade A market that will be coming on in the next 6 to 12 months. But when you actually look at corporate demand drivers and what's key to them, so in addition to the amenities that I've mentioned, and in addition to the grade A space and the right location and the right design in terms of efficiency and flexibility in that terms, the real drivers for corporates at the moment are looking at lease flexibility, right? So if you're looking at a 5-year lease, they want to see multiple break options within that lease. They want expansion rights at multiple times during their lease period. They want the ability to hand back space if they need to. And they're really looking at ways to be dynamic in terms of the way they occupy space and the way that the landlords actually respond to their needs. So where we're seeing landlords that are very successful or more successful than others, those landlords are starting to really understand corporate occupier demand preferences and understand that lease flexibility outside of the bricks and mortar of the building is really a driving force behind how they make decisions on real estate. As I mentioned, vacancy levels are very high. They will continue to be high at least in the next 6 to 12 months as new property comes onto the market. And this will continue to drive and put pressure on the rents. So that's what I have, and I would like to invite the panelists up.